Edo is full of the curses of wronged women. Several of the stories featured in this series already have been on that very topic, and this week's story is no exception. Because when you have a woman scorned in Edo, you can pretty much guarantee that death and vengeance will follow. This week, we're looking at the curse of Otami. The year was 1810. Yazaemon worked for a retainer of the shogun by the name of Mizuno Seiroku. Mizuno had business at the imperial palace in Kyoto, and thus Yazaemon accompanied him on his trip. Whilst there, Yazaemon ran into a young Kyoto woman by the name of Otami. He immediately fell head over heels for her and made her his mistress. Mizuno and Yazaemon ended up staying in Kyoto for 2 years, but when it was time to return to Edo, Yazaemon couldn't bear to leave Otami behind. He thought to take her back with him, but her parents steadfastly refused. Otami was 18 at the time, but regardless, her parents refused to give her permission to leave with this much older man. Yet, Yazaemon refused to give up on her, and in the end, Otami's parents told her, "If you simply must go to Edo, then we will never speak to you again." Leaving the decision in Otami's hands, she decided to return to Edo with Yazaemon, cutting all ties with her family. Yet, when they got there, Yazaemon, whose previous wife was already dead, refused to marry her. He kept her in his house as his mistress, and his daughter Otoki, from his previous wife, found this most distasteful. She insisted that Otami leave their house as she could no longer bear the impropriety, and because Yazaemon still refused to marry her, he had no choice but to ask Otami to leave the very same house he had forced her to leave her family for. Yet, he didn't drive her out onto the streets. Instead, he asked a friend, a village chief by the name of Magotaro, to take her in. Magotaro was an upright and respectable man, and so he welcomed this lost woman into his household. Yet his wife Otaki was not quite as accepting as he was, and she quickly took to bullying poor Otami, almost starving her to death. As time passed, this bullying got worse, and she too wished to drive Otami out. She insisted the woman was a hindrance and begged her husband to remove her from the house and have her live in the storehouse instead. Magotaro was uncomfortable with this idea, but Otaki was so insistent that in the end he relented, and Otami was driven out once again. Yet, even the storehouse wasn't good enough, and before long, Otaki insisted she be kicked out for good. It wasn't that she feared Otami's youth or good looks, not at all. Magotaro's wife was a serial cheater, and having Otami around was cramping her style. While her husband was out running the village and being an upstanding man, she was constantly sleeping around behind his back, and she feared that this would be discovered with Otami around the house. And so, Magotaro was forced to kick Otami out, and with nowhere left to go, she returned to Yazaemon and begged him to take her back in. "Go back to Kyoto," he cruelly told her, but both knew she couldn't do that. Her parents had cut all ties with her when she abandoned them to come to Edo with him. She truly had nowhere left to go, and so Otami drowned herself. 3 years passed, and in 1813, Yazaemon suddenly fell ill. His daughter Otoki, briefly losing her senses, also threw herself into a well. She survived, yet Yazaemon's sickness continued. In the end, it finally claimed him, and Otoki was forced to move in with other relatives. Yazaemon also had another daughter, Oine, and before long, her 5-year-old son drowned. After her incident with the well and her father's passing, nothing much else happened to Otoki, but 14 years after Otami's death, Magotaro also passed away. There was nothing suspicious about his death. After all, despite driving Otami out, he had been kind to her and was an otherwise upstanding man, But the terror was just about to begin for his wife, Otaki. Her eldest son, Magotaro II, was the polar opposite of his father, and his behaviour was so terrible that it got him removed from the office of village chief. He set out to find other employment, yet instead contracted syphilis and was forced to return home. His condition worsened, and at times he could be found screaming, "It's deep! So deep!" and grabbing at the air like he was drowning. He spat obscenities at his mother Otaki, and, before long, also passed away. Her second son, Kosaburo, was then also kicked out of the village chief post and returned during his older brother's funeral, spouting nonsense and acting strangely. He too was found muttering, "It's deep! So deep!" and scratching at the air like he was drowning. And just like his older brother, whenever he saw his mother, he shouted foul obscenities at her. "You are truly a terrible person," he said. "I will devour you." It didn't take the populace long to put two and two together, and soon rumours began to spread that this was all part of Otami's curse. Little is known about what happened to Otaki after that. Perhaps Otami's curse extended only to killing the men around her. After all, Yazaemon's daughter survived as well, even though she was the reason Otami was forced out in the first place. But for the men related to these two women, they stood no chance, and people blamed it all on the curse of Otami, forced to take her life with no home to return to anywhere. As Edo reminds us again and again, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. Otami wasn't the first, and she certainly wasn't the last. Be careful who you toss out onto the street. They might continue to haunt you and your family for decades after. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you again next time.